Let me briefly introduce the speakers. I don't think that any of them requires introduction. I'm sure that all of you have read their writings, books, chapters, interventions. But I'm very happy today that we have with us Professor Monica Hakimi from Columbia Law School, Professor Devika Hovell from London School of Economics Law School, Professor Marko Milanovic from Reading University School of Law, Professor Mutaz Qafisheh from the College of Law and Political Science at Hebron University, Professor Yuval Shany from the Center for Transnational Legal Studies at King's College London, and also Hebron University Faculty of Law, and last but not least, Professor and also Dr. Ganna Yudkivska, I'm sorry, Ganna, former judge of the European Court of Human Rights and current member of the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, but also an academic herself in Ukraine. So after this very brief introduction, I'm sure you all know the theme of this online roundtable, which is basically the role of international law within the most visible ongoing armed conflicts, the one in Ukraine and the other one in Middle East, especially Israel and Gaza. The idea, the structure of this roundtable is to have a discussion. There will be a first round of intervention among our scholars, where I'm going to ask them particular questions, and then they will give their take. And then we have a second round of interventions, but also there will be the possibility for the audience to raise their comments on chat, and we will finish within an hour and 30 minutes. So I will try to be very strict with the time because there are so many things and themes that they can cover. So what was the rationale behind that? I have to say that all the time I get questions from our students at the Department of War Studies. What's the point of international law? So a couple of days ago, actually, I had this thing that it was very unsatisfactory how international law works, because generally it is full of unfulfilled expectations. And I can say that during these two armed conflicts, one could observe a bit of extremes. Either we have inaction, which is very common, or we have hyperaction, which is, I would say, it's not so common in international legal praxis. So especially with the two ongoing conflicts, we saw massive judicial intervention and several activities in the UN framework. On the other hand, we also saw experimental litigation before international courts and tribunals, which is worth it of our attention. And as I say before, many, many high expectations and many unfulfilled expectations. So I stop here. I don't want to take more of the time of our speakers. And on this note, I would like to ask this first round of intervention by asking Anna, in particular, being a former judge at the European Court of Human Rights herself and a legal scholar. Anna, what is your take from the European Court of Human Rights action activity with regard to Ukraine? I would say not only now since 2022, but even before. And also, if you would like to comment on the intervention of the International Criminal Court, which acted very, very fast immediately, as I would say, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. Good evening, everyone. Let me start with a very sad Latin maximum, silentium leges interim arma. In times of war, law falls silent, which we believe is an anachronism that we cannot accept in modern international law, but the reality proves it's still right. One very short side note. In 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus, numerous human rights violations. Final judgment on just satisfaction was delivered by the European Court in 2014. So 40 years later, this judgment is still not enforced. Now, annexation of Crimea took place in 2014. The judgment on merits was delivered this year, 10 years later. Justice delayed is justice denied, as we used to say. Now we still have 9,000 individual applications related to all those conflicts, Crimea, Donbass, and the recent full-scale invasion. Just 9,000 individual applications. Consider this figure and the very limited resources the court has. On 1st March 2022, a couple of days after Russia launched its full-scale invasion, The court acknowledged the immediate and profound threat to civil rights and applied interim measure directed at Russia only, not to all parties like in all previous cases, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, even Crimean and Donbass case. And the scope and language of this measure in 2024 made it really exceptional. So the European Court explicitly called on Russia to cease military attacks on civilians and civilian objects, school, hospitals, ambulances, to ensure safety of medical personnel, to guarantee access to safe evacuation routes. And then the conflict escalated. And then later the court expanded its scope to address forced deportations, emphasizing that evacuation routes must lead to safer regions within Ukraine and not to Russia territory. And what makes this move from the court even more extraordinary is the fact that this interim measure was ordered despite the precedent set by the Georgia versus Russia 2 judgment, saying that active military hostilities fell outside the jurisdiction of states under the convention due to chaos and lack of effective control. It shows that the court itself is a bit lost, yes, with these war-related findings, and the issue of lack of jurisdiction during active phase of hostilities is still not clarified by the court. Yeah, we're expecting it will be clarified soon. But those interim measures, again, in this context, were more like an outcry, yeah, more like moral stance of the court rather than a judicial decision with any practical implications. In the Crimean judgment the court delivered this year, it didn't say anything about Russia not respecting interim measure issued by the court for this case back in February 2014. So in any case, the court affirms even in war, rule of law must prevail. Now, the question is, what do we expect from international judge? Coming to Crimean judgment of this year, very briefly, it's huge legal text, remarkable balancing act between legal principles and pragmatism. The court avoided direct pronouncement on territorial sovereignty, but it applied international humanitarian law to establish that Russia controls Crimea. However, the word occupation was put in inverted commas throughout the whole text. And this allowed the court to reach very strong conclusion about rights violation while sidestepping potentially explosive political questions about Crimean status. So the court left it to the ICJ. And speaking about 9,000 individual cases, the court somehow paved the way for them, making it easier for them and to the court itself to prove violations in those individual cases, stressing a lot on administrative practice. And also its important conclusion that Russian law cannot be regarded as law in the meaning of the convention. So the court effectively invalidated every legal act taken by the Russian authorities in Crimea since the occupation began. This means that any restriction of rights based on Russian law automatically fails the legality test under the convention. Plus, all the courts operating today in Crimea are not tribunals established by law. It makes so much easier for everyone on this territory to complain about any alleged violation directly to the European Court. But the practical implication of this so far remain, well, close to zero, sorry. And we expect the judgment on Donbass case very soon, either before end of the year or beginning of 2025, again, 10 years after the events. And the interstate case, Ukraine versus Russia, number 10, on alleged mass human rights violations during this full-scale invasion since 24 February 2022, is not even yet communicated. So we can expect many important legal developments, important legal positions. However, it's a very long, if not to say eternal, way to real justice and to what people do expect. Now, speaking about the ICC role very briefly, the recent developments that perfectly illustrate the challenges. So there is a striking contrast. We have Mongolia, an ICC member state that failed to arrest Putin despite a valid arrest warrant. What Mongolia will do if they arrest him, it's another story, given its very particular geographical situation, but again, it's a different story on the one hand. And we have Ukraine taking major steps to embrace the ICC jurisdiction. Ukraine will become a full ICC member since January 2025. And while it's using an opt-out clause to protect its own forces. It maintained open pathways for prosecuting Russian war crimes through its earlier declarations. So those parallel developments reflect this complex nature of international justice. We know that the ICC effectiveness is not about immediate enforcement. Yeah, it's about building long-term frameworks for accountability. Putin can travel freely to many countries today, we know this, but we hope that legal groundwork being laid could have implications for decades to come, although given some recent developments with the ICC, the colleagues will address today, I have my doubts. And there is also another issue on special tribunal on crimes of aggression, which maybe I will address after listening to colleagues. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was a very strong start of your intervention. You touched upon so many issues. I'm sure in the second round there will be comments on that. Marko, I would like to continue with you, and maybe you can continue a little bit with the European Court of Human Rights with regard to Ukraine, and also if you wanted to talk about the ICJ as well, where this is where I spoke about the experimental litigation. This is how I characterize it. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you, Maria, for inviting me and for organizing this. I mean, let me just very, very briefly reflect on your overarching theme of, like, you know, these big expectations of international law, which international law and courts seem to be not capable of meeting. I mean, I would just say this is how law works or doesn't work, whether it's international or domestic. You know, there is often, even in the most highly developed domestic legal systems, a huge gulf between the is and the ought. And one cannot expect international law to behave any differently. So look at American law. Yeah. In American law, a guy tried to overthrow the elections and overthrow the republic. And what happened? He got reelected president. Yeah. So I'm not sure international law is less law-like than the law of the United States or the law of many, many, many other countries, which is where, again, the gap between the is and the ought is enormous, right? So that's my first point. On the European Court of Human Rights, the big thing we're gonna look at is the outcome of this Ukraine-Russia case about the war, or about some aspects of the war, which concerns the downing of the MH17, concerns artillery shelling in the Donbass in 2014. It concerns some parts of the war from 2022, February to September, right? So there are some aspects of that case that will be decided soon. Probably not in the next month, but certainly next year. So the court held grand chamber hearings this year. And as Anna was explaining, there are some really important questions that really the court needs to grapple with in that case. One is this whole question of extraterritorial application that has plagued the court for decades, on which it has developed an incredibly confusing jurisprudence. The other intersecting with it is the application of the Convention on Human Rights generally during armed conflict. And the court basically has been pushed by Western states in particular over the past 20 years to adopt very restrictive interpretations of the Convention in Armed Conflict because they didn't want to be scrutinized by the court as to what they do in Afghanistan or Iraq, or when they bomb Serbia, or when they bomb Libya, or when they do whatever. Yeah. So suddenly now the Ukrainian situation is politically very different from that, and the court has to come up with a different approach. And there are a number of things that the court can do. There are several options that the court can choose. One is to say that everything that happens in the conflict is covered by the convention. This is, to my mind, the right approach. Another possible opportunity or sort of option is to say, well, it's only covered by the convention if it happens on the territory of a European state, like Ukraine. That Europe is somehow special, but that other conflicts that European states fight outside Europe are not covered. That, I think, is a double standard kind of approach that the court should avoid. And then the third approach would be to say, Georgia versus Russia, context of chaos, the convention does not apply in war. Somehow I doubt that the court will repeat that horrible decision in Georgia versus Russia. So it's options 1 and 2 that seem to me most likely. But let's see what the court actually does. Listeners might want to read the third-party interventions filed by various states in this case. So this case there's never been a case where so many other states have intervened. And all of these states are intervening on behalf of Ukraine, but there are actually many twists in how they do it. And 2 states in particular, and they're the UK and France, kind of support Russia because they're saying the convention does not apply to active hostilities. Under their view, if you bomb the hell out of another country, the convention does not apply. So I think that will be really the key thing to watch in that case. Now, what might come out of that case, obviously, is something symbolic, as Anna was saying, but this is the only case probably which which Ukraine might be able to use to take some, or at least will use, to try to take some of those frozen Russian assets which are frozen by European countries, especially Belgium, on the basis that there's an international judgment ordering reparation. But let's see what happens on that front. Finally, when it comes to the ICJ, this was a year of failure to some extent for Ukraine. So it lost the one case which dealt with the Convention on Racial Discrimination and the Convention on Terrorist Financing. And it basically lost in the preliminary objections judgment in the case brought into the Genocide Convention by Ukraine against Russia when the big war, when the full-scale invasion started. So those are disappointing outcomes, but I think what Ukraine really wanted, certainly from the 2022 Genocide Convention case, was to obtain provisional measures, and Ukraine did get that. Yeah, and Russia did flaunt and violate those provisional measures, which were the most sort of explicit measures the court ever ordered. It ordered Russia to stop the war, and Russia failed to comply. So that's what Ukraine has. It does not have the possibility, though, to use the ICJ as a vehicle for obtaining reparation. It's interesting to compare the third case in particular to the Crimea judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, because the ICJ in the third case basically says Ukraine hasn't proven that Crimean Tatars were subjected to ethnic or racial discrimination, whereas the European Court finds exactly the opposite. And it's really interesting to observe why what explains these 2 outcomes. One explanation is different approach to questions of proof, and the European Court drawing adverse inferences from Russia's failure to cooperate, which the ICJ does not do. And the other would be the racial/ethnic angle, which might have been too much for the ICJ to swallow. So I will finish here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marko, for highlighting those issues. What I took from you at this first intervention is the issue of interventions of third parties. And I think this is a very important development we can discuss maybe further. So, Devika, I come to you. We talked already about the judicial intervention, but we had different activities in other fora, and I'm talking about the UN. And again, usually the focus is so much on the Security Council, the usual saga of the Security Council in action. But we saw also the General Assembly being more involved and more active. And I was wondering, what is your take regarding those parallel developments?
Thanks very much, Maria. Yeah, and thank you again for the opportunity to join you all. So yes, the UN. So, this is the chaos of global politics, as I think we've heard already. And we have a big problem that was revealed in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, and now in Israel with the Gaza conflict, that public condemnation still lacks a powerful political form in the international arena. So even once the global political machinery has run these disputes through its cycle, we can be left with this clash of standpoints. And even at the ICJ, reading through some of the media articles, I remember one journalist observing in the South Africa and Israel case, something along the lines that he described hearing 2 entirely different narratives as if from 2 different universes. So, you know, sometimes it feels like in the place of sort of mechanisms for political communication in the international sphere, we've erected sort of towers of Babel, which serve only to entrench all the participants in their clashing viewpoints and render everyone unable to engage with or comprehend those who disagree with them. But you've asked me to talk about the Security Council and the General Assembly and their role in Ukraine. There, as you say, the Security Council we tend to think of as this primary organ, not least because the Charter tells us it is the primary organ for the maintenance of international peace and security. But it too, of course, speaks in many political tongues. So I'm sure most of you recall the frankly astonishing scenes in the Council on the outbreak of the invasion in February 2022, where Ukraine's ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Kislitsia, appearing before the Council, appealed to the Council through its president that it is the responsibility of this body to stop the war. And he's interrupted in his remarks by the Security Council president, who says it is not called a war, it's a special military operation. Of course, the president of the Security Council at the time was the Russian Federation. A remarkable scene. So the Janus face of the council on stark display that day. And then recently in the Gaza context as well, we've had the 10 elected members roundly criticising the US for blocking the resolution they'd put forward for a ceasefire. So there's many things we could say about the council, its need for reform, to its membership and structure, particularly around the outbreak or around the invasion by Russia. We saw many clever arguments from lawyers that suggest that the Russian Federation had no claim to the seat on the council, or alternatively it should be expelled. There are regular calls to remove the veto power or just ignore it. We did have the operation of the Uniting for Peace resolution, shifting the focus from the Council to the General Assembly resolution. Zelensky's comments, President Zelensky's comments in his remarks to the Council in September 2023, though, expressed the dissatisfaction of many. He said, "These are the situations that have changed everything for the UN. We should recognise that the UN finds itself in a deadlock on the matters of aggression. Humankind no longer pins its hopes on the UN. When it comes to the defence of the sovereign bodies of nations, world leaders are seeking new platforms and alliances that could reduce the disastrous scope of problems, the problems that are met here within these walls with rhetoric rather than real solutions, with aspirations to compromise with killers rather than to protect lives. Lives should be defended uncompromisingly to ensure successful protection." So it's very clear that the Security Council is a forum where we regularly see on display double standards, exceptionalism, hypocrisy. The Security Council is seen to achieve only partial justice, which in itself seems like an oxymoron. Partial justice is injustice. So it might surprise you that the position I want to put forward today is that we should leave the structure exactly as it is. So Marko's talked about this dissonance between the is and the ought, but potentially the is an ought. So that's not to say that nothing need change. My view is that we've actually lost sight of the role of the Council, and in particular, its role in the broader framework of collective security. So collective security was a policy developed in the wake of the two world wars to get away from this system of alliances, of balance of power that we potentially see Zelensky call upon once again. We need to restore alliances. But nevertheless, collective security was seen as the solution to that as a problem. It's been described as the dominant purpose, the supreme ideal of the 20th century. But my question for us as international lawyers, and I know I can include those on screen and probably a lot of you who are here today, do we as international lawyers really know what collective security means? So what is collective about collective security? Does it mean that every state has to participate in the response to threats or breaches to the international peace and security? Does it mean that every state has a say in the response? Clearly, that's not the case. For many of us, though, the Security Council is a synonym for collective security. But does collective security actually boil down to what the Council decides or doesn't decide? And I'd argue that actually collective security is far more than what the Security Council says or does. So I've only got a couple more minutes more, but I just want to tie together the idea, the perennial problem that war usually involves clashing viewpoints, and the fact that our key institutions, namely the Security Council, can't effectively resolve those clashes, particularly where the clash is with one of the permanent five, and that actually partiality is baked into the Security Council regime, but most importantly, that collective security is far broader than the council. So in this concluding minute, I'm going to test your patience a little by wading in with a bit of theoretical thinking into what is more appropriately a very practical discussion. But in monitoring the state of the world as an academic, it seems to me we really have lost sight of what collective security means. And my acute prediction is that things are only going to get worse with President Trump, I mean. And all this makes it increasingly difficult to construct arguments about what states, including permanent members of the council, can and cannot do. So I'm working on a piece at the moment where I seek to explain the concept of the collective and collective security. I have to say at this point, Monica, I've said this to you before, but your article with Jacob Katz-Kogan, and I recommend it to you all, on 2 codes for the use of force, it's ever the article that my students say, this finally illuminates everything for me. So far be it from me to disagree with you on that, but I'm going to, because that's much more fun. So, you know, I'm certainly not entirely disagreeing, but I think that 2 codes, so just to explain for those 1 or 2 who haven't read the piece, the idea that there's an institutional code, it's to explain the jus ad bellum, there's an institutional code and a state code. And certainly that they're separate, but of course they interact, that the institutional code gives legitimacy to what states want to do. So where the institutions authorize that gives legitimacy, but the states, the powerful states in particular, render effective what the institutions might authorize. Now, my suggestion is, and it is certainly not a completely opposing viewpoint, but that actually I'm looking at the collective in terms of 3 perspectives. And I'd like to explain those perspectives in terms of a view from everywhere, a view from nowhere, and a view from somewhere. And I think I'd like to see that as a Venn diagram where collective security actually is where those 3 perspectives intersect. The view from everywhere is really about the international community and value making. And if we look at that institutionally, it's the General Assembly that's the best forum for that. So when we look at the General Assembly's engagement with these conflicts, this is where we see a pluralistic discourse. And so we get a sense of a boiling down to what collective security is supposed to uphold and enforce, including against whom it should be upheld and enforced. I'm going to rush through these others because we're going to talk about the view from nowhere, might be obvious, is about the lawmaking, the legal decision makers. I've been really interested to understand the role of the ICJ, the ECHR, the ICC in these disputes, and the importance of having, even if they're not enforced, the court's role of arriving at an objectively reasonable interpretation of the facts and the law, guided by a shared set of standards and procedures common to both sides, and the importance of impartiality there. And I'm not sure whether we will have time, but Sebatinder's judgment, I think we need to call out. I really believe that, and it's interesting, I set it for reading for my students in our big undergrad course, and one of our class teachers declined to allow her students to read it because she said it's not worth the paper it's written on. I think it performs a role in that judgment, but I feel that it's gone too far and that her impartiality can be questioned. I'm not saying that she's in the pockets of anything, there's any corruption there, but I would be interested to a close reading of that judgment, because I think impartiality really is the bedrock of that judicial function. And just so I'm not can be accused of not being too bland in my comments, there's a point that I think really needs to be said more about. The view from somewhere is about decision making, and this is the council. It's a view from somewhere. It's about the role of authority. And so the question is really what it means to have that view from somewhere, to act on behalf of a membership, and the idea that it's not just the council that can perform that authoritative role. Now, I think I've gone well beyond my time, Maria. I'll end it there, but it's just a little gloss on what we might understand by collective security.
Thank you very much, Devika. As I say, there are so many things you raise, all of you, and I hope we'll have time to come back to that, because you raised many things that I believe others would like to comment about how collective is a collective security, and all the three views. We will come back to that. I'm pretty sure I have comments on that. But having said that, I would like to move from this first the focus on Ukraine to move to Israel and Gaza in particular. And on that note, I would like to give first the floor to Yuval and to share with us his reflection based on the previous conflict in Ukraine, highlighting similarities, differences, and generally what does he see with regard to the ICC, but also the ICJ. Yuval.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for having us and for convening this very interesting and diverse panel. So yes, I mean, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to try to maybe suggest that the way in which the international bodies, especially the ICJ and the ICC, have dealt with the Israel-Palestine issue has been informed and perhaps even shaped by the way in which the same bodies have shortly before dealt with the Russia-Ukraine situation, and that there has been some path determinacy that I would say has suffered from certain problems which emanate from conflicting expectations. One is the expectation that is encapsulated by the double standards criticism that you have indicated, and that is there is a very justified expectation that similar cases will be treated similarly, and that if a certain step had been taken in context A, this sets a level of expectations for what sort of steps should be taken in the subsequent context B. But of course, there is also a conflicting narrative, and the idea that there are different narratives and different parallel universes exist all the time, and that is the idea of nuanced treatment, and that is that actually different cases should be treated differently, and that therefore a measure that is applicable in one context may not be actually adequate for another context where some elements are different. And since, like beauty, differences in the eye of the beholder, and what to some would look at similar, for others, to others would look very different, I think we are seeing here, I think this is an interesting, perhaps, angle to evaluate the performance of the ICC and the ICJ in both cases. So we have seen, in a way, Russia has set the mold. I mean, the treatment of Russia, especially after the full invasion in 2022, did set a relatively high standard of expectations, because these courts, with the active support of major Western powers, has gone in ways that it has not gone before. It has gone quite aggressively. And we've already mentioned the provisional measures in 2022, which were remarkable, not only in that the court gave the party more than the party actually requested, which is in itself quite remarkable, but also that they actually ordered Russia to stop the war on the basis, of course, as we know, and Marko alluded to that, of a somewhat imaginative reading of the Genocide Convention. So we had one case, multiple interventions, a very aggressive provisional measure remedy, generally applauded by the West. And then with regard to the ICC, we've also seen quite an aggressive reaction by the court, which manifests itself in the issuance in 2023 of a public request for arrest warrant accepted by the court against Vladimir Putin. And this, again, sets a high threshold of expectations that the same standards would apply to the next conflict, the next major conflicts, which creates the same kind of strong reaction in parts of the international community. And then when Gaza comes a year later, after 2022, we do see an attempt to replicate the Putin playbook, and that is to bring a genocide case to the International Court of Justice and request for provisional measures that would order the stop of the war, halting the war. And in parallel, we see this move in the ICC in the same set of measures, that is to issue in real time, I mean, when the war is still going on, to issue in real time and in public an arrest warrant against the leader of the relevant state. So we do see, in a way, this idea that we are following the same playbook. But of course, what is different is, I will say, the ICJ, I will mention, dealt with it somewhat differently. But what is differently is also, and quite obviously, is the response by some major powers in the West. Perhaps the most obvious example today is the way France has taken an about face with regard to the issue of head of state immunity, suggesting that what worked for Putin, or what their legal system could do in regard to the Putin arrest warrant might be actually a bit more complicated when it comes to Netanyahu. So why is this change in approach? So you could say one is that, states are hypocritical. States are political animals, and it's fine for the ICC to indict Putin and Bashir, and today Min Hong Liang from Myanmar. These issues, that's fine. But once once it goes against someone who is within our bloc, within our group of reference, that's of course a much more serious situation. So one possible explanation is hypocrisy. And those explanations, by the way, are not mutually exclusive. Another is that simply, the time has changed. The times have changed. I mean, there were elections in the United States. And as the saying goes, elections have consequences. And since it's not that the Biden administration was crazy about the ICC, they were also harshly critical of the ICC, especially with regard to Israel, not so much with regard to Putin. But now you have an administration that is viscerally hates the ICC, and is going to take not only strong measures against the ICC, it is also threatening to take strong measures against countries that fund and support the ICC, including, I think, Canada is on the list of countries that will be targeted because it is supportive of the ICC. And that's changed the whole geopolitical alignment of states. So it's not that states are only hypocritical. They also are political animals that look after their geopolitical interests that have changed in the months that have passed since the Putin arrest warrant. But I would also say that there is also a third layer, and that all things are somewhat connected, and that is that there are similarities, of course, between atrocities in Ukraine and atrocities in Gaza, but there are also some major differences. And I would like to point in the time that I have, which, as I imagine, Maria, quite limited. I would like to point to differences that I think have affected the way either the courts have conducted themselves or the way in which third parties have referred to the court. So first, with regard to the ICJ, I think the ICJ was rightly reluctant to replicate the playbook that was introduced with regard to Russia, Ukraine, with regard to Israel and Gaza, simply because the conflict, the way in which the conflict started, was radically different. And there is a significant difference between waging an unprovoked war of aggression than waging a war of self-defense. Now you can say, they've gone too far, they have exceeded the Caroline conditions, what have you. But it would have been very difficult for the court in January 2024 to issue provisional measures that would require Israel to stop what was perceived at that time, and I think still perceived maybe by some, as a war of self-defense. And therefore, I thought the court actually struck a good balance in its provisional measures by effectively ordering Israel not to commit genocide and dealing with some of the specific issues, incitement and humanitarian aid, and actually distinguishing its approach to Israel from the approach that it has taken only just over a year before, almost 2 years before, with regard to Russia. I think what happened next, and then I don't have a lot of time, is that the court came under increased pressure to up the notch, to take it up. And maybe the court, in my view, made a mistake in reopening provisional measures again and again and trying to deal in real time in micromanaging the war campaign, which I would argue the court doesn't have the capacity and access to evidence to do properly. But that's what I wanted to say about the ICJ. The ICC, it's different because the ICC did replicate the playbook. And here I think the difference that the ICC has not perhaps factored in sufficiently is the issue of complementarity. And when you look at the American, even the Biden administration criticism of the court, this is at the heart of the criticism. And that is the issue of complementarity. And the difference here is that whereas Russia is a country without a functioning legal system, that could have any chance of bringing any justice against any senior politician, Netanyahu will stand in court next week in December 2nd before the District Court of Jerusalem and start giving his defense evidence in the corruption case against him. Now, that doesn't mean that Israel, has done anything that resembles a reasonable job in terms of accountability with regard to Gaza. But I think there is here a sense that when you are dealing with countries with more or less functioning legal systems, bringing on them the full weight of the court without actually giving their domestic legal systems a reasonable time frame to react is a mistake. And I think Western countries some Western countries are concerned about this approach. And, Jana criticized the European Court for Justice for long cases. But in a way, it's almost inevitable when you're dealing with complicated issues and with countries that have, in many cases, domestic legal systems that are also active. I think the expectation that you can, in a very short timeline, you can anticipate a legal system to come out with criminal investigations against the prime minister during war, I think it is somewhat of an unrealistic set of expectation. And the Israelis, of course, are saying double standards. Why did you give the UK, with the Iraq cases, you gave them indefinite time to deal, establish the Hayat and all the investigations, and in the end not prosecute anyone, and still that is complementarity. Why did the prosecutor go to Venezuela and sign the memorandum of understanding with Maduro in order to have Venezuela investigate the atrocities committed there? Why did the prosecutor give more than a decade to Colombia to come out with the peace and law initiative? And for Israel, there are only the expectation is that within few months, while the war is raging, there will be a criminal investigation against the prime minister. And I think that some of the pushback that we are now seeing against the court is because the sense that the court has overreached and has applied the same playbook to a very different set of facts. I'll stop here, Maria.
Thank you very much, Yuval. Again, a very rich interventions on conflicting expectations. I would like to give immediately the floor to Mutaz. And Mutaz, I would like your comments and your take about this judicial intervention, both of the ICC and the ICJ, to the overall Palestinian cause. What is your understanding? Thank you.
Thank you very Maria for inviting me, and I'm happy to be with this group of professors. I would just start by saying that a general comment about the international legal order. I think the international legal order is facing a moment of crisis. I think we are at the international level at the brink of collapse. since the Second World War. I think nothing is jeopardizing international law as what is going on at this time. I would like also to just to comment on the theme of this webinar, and especially the concept is of Israel-Gaza war. It is not actually Israel-Gaza war. It is a war by Israel against Palestine and against the very existence of the Palestinian people. Systematic genocide against the Palestinian people, both in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and even globally. I live in the West Bank and partially in East Jerusalem. I work in the West Bank and I live in East Jerusalem. And we could see that the systematic destruction of the Palestinian lives on daily basis. Settler violence are going on almost daily. Checkpoints are everywhere. Just to go from Jerusalem, where I live, to Hebron, where I teach, which is just 30 kilometers, I need to think a lot and spend like sometimes hours to think about my way, how I can go, and if I go, would I be able to go back or not, because of the Israeli checkpoints. That there are hundreds of checkpoints are everywhere in this area. Killing is the order of the day, all over the place. Settlements are expanding on daily basis. Annexation, land confiscation, home demolishing, destroying almost every part of the Palestinian lives. So it is not really a war against Gaza. It is a war against Palestine and the Palestinians. And here comes the issue of international law. Is international law is really relevant at this time? And here we think, as international lawyers, international professors, international law professors, you know, we always dealt with the question of is international law law? No, it's an old question of 200 years ago. And I think many of the people in the world, around the world, I think, including our students, are asking this question. But also the other question: is international law really international? Is it really a universal law that applies to everybody? Obviously, the answer is obviously not. We figured out after 15 years of teaching international law and telling my students that international law is a universal law that should be applied everywhere. We just wake up and discovered that international law is really a colonial law. It's a Western law. It's a law for the powerful in the world to control and suppress those who are powerless, including at international courts. So if we start with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, I think the International Court of Justice is an aging institution. I think it's all now it's more than 100 years old institutions, and I think it's time for it to retire because it's unable to face international crisis. Although it decided very nice advisory opinion last July about the illegality of Israeli occupation of Palestine, but we all know that neither the court nor the General Assembly would be able to apply any of its paragraphs, including in that advisory opinion. So the court is really facing a crisis because it will not be able to apply. And now, and again, the reason is that the West, the powerful countries, are not interested in ending Israeli occupation. But if we move to the other case regarding the genocide case, the court also dealt with it in very, very slow manner, dealing with it as a business as usual, seeing tens of thousands of civilians being killed in Gaza, including 20,000 kids are died under the Israeli rebel with Western, especially American weapons. And the court is doing business as usual. You know, I think it's the first time in history where the court is looking for a genocide, live stream genocide before the judges' eyes, and judges just issuing interim measures. And these interim measures are very shy interim measures, just not advising Israel not to commit genocide. The court was unable even to decide on the cessation of hostilities and to implement effective measures that force Israel to stop its genocide in Gaza. And again, if we go to the ICC, again, the ICC was very, very slow. One of the commentators said that delayed justice is denial of justice. The court, the ICC, has been following the case of Palestine since 2009, and always creating plays and maneuvers just to delay the prosecution for war criminals, starting from Luis Mario Ocampo, who created the issue of Palestine statehood, moving towards Fatou Bensouda, who started, the investigation in 2015, but delaying it another. She took 4 years just to be convinced that there are crimes going on in Palestine. Although everybody knows, these crimes are unprecedented crimes, that they are very, very clear to everybody. But then Karim Khan also decided to deprioritize the issue of Palestine, and we had to wait until the genocide starts and to let Karim Khan move a little bit to issue very shy arrest warrants or application for arrest warrants against just 2 Israeli war criminals. How come the court can or Karim Khan apply for the arrest warrants of just 2 Israeli politicians and 3 Palestinians who were not really involved in hostilities, like Ismail Haniyeh? At the same time, ignoring the fact that most crimes were carried out by the chief of staff of the Israeli army. Why Haledi is not on the list of arrest warrants, while Ismail Haniyeh was on that list? Why not the chief of the Israeli Air Force? Most of the crimes in Gaza were committed by the Israeli jets, aeroplanes. Why the bombing went unnoticed by Karim Khan? Why Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who called for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians and who are proudly calling for genocide, are not on the list? So I think the arrest warrant were very, very shy by the court, and also the application did not include the crime of genocide. So this gives some green light for those who are interested in committing genocide to continue in their crimes. So, like, just in general, that again, the international system in general, and maybe I also would comment on Security Council, but maybe at the end. International system in general is undergoing crisis, and I had to agree with one thing that Netanyahu said one time. He said United Nations is UN is united nothing, and the actions of the United Nations on the ground is showing that he is correct. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mutaz, for once more a very rich intervention and very critical remarks. I'm pretty sure there will be also comments, and I want to give now the floor also to Monica for waiting for an hour to give us her own take about the current developments. And Mutaz also spoke about the advisory opinion that we had last July regarding the nature of the occupation. And Monica, I don't want to take more of your time. Please, you have the floor. What would you like to comment in particular within those developments about the broader context, of the conflict? Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. Maria as well. And yeah, I guess I'll start by talking a little bit about the advisory opinion. And my overall sort of message is that the advisory opinion, in my view, properly reflects the proper emotional need to do something about the situation in Palestine, Israel, but in my view also fails to fully expose the severity of the problem. And so let me tell you why. So first of all, the ICJ, the ICJ, of course, says in the advisory opinion that the occupation is, that Israel's presence and occupation of the occupied Palestine territory is unlawful and needs to cease. And so that's sort of like the landmark move that the court makes. And the problems that I think this decision sort of both exposes and in some ways obscures is, first of all, that the law of occupation was developed for a different kind of paradigm. So it assumes a paradigm in which there are interstate war, and one state then, in the conduct of an interstate war, occupies another state and exercises full control over it, and then administers that other state. And for a variety of reasons, although Palestine is recognized by many states as a state, it does not have the institutional structures of statehood in the same way that the paradigm sort of imagines. And so this cannot just be sort of assumed away. It's a fact on the ground that the law of occupation does not adequately itself address, because the law of occupation imagines that there are two states, one exercising control and administering the other. The second problem in the law and in politics that this opinion sort of exposes but also does not quite address is that there's nothing internal to IHL or the law of occupation for figuring out how to wind down an occupation. And the reason there's nothing internal to it is that historically the law of occupation emerged in a period in which annexations of foreign territory were permissible. And so occupations were oftentimes a first step toward annexing territory. And of course, once the prohibition of annexations came into effect, occupations became the sort of stopgap for preventing annexations of territory. But there's nothing internal to it to figure out when an occupation needs to end. And so the court relies, of course, on the jus ad bellum to try to do that. But there's also nothing internal to the jus ad bellum, and this is the third problem, to figure out how to deal with the disposition of territory following a use of force. Jus ad bellum deals specifically with threats or uses of force. It does not deal with the disposition of title to territory, although many say, including the court, that it's assumed that if the use of force is unlawful, then so too is the acquisition of territory pursuant to that use of force. The thing is, and this is sort of an inconvenient fact that the court does not quite address, is that at the time that the charter was adopted, and this is just, I'm saying this drawing on my work, my recent piece with Ingrid Brunk, so I definitely want to give her credit for part of what I'm saying. At the time the charter was adopted, it wasn't clear that whether what are sometimes referred to as defensive annexations taken pursuant to a defensive use of force, whether those were or were not lawful. And in fact, there's a lot of language in the ILC in the period immediately and among people who were at the time highly respected scholars in the period following the adoption of the charter that suggested that this was at least an open question, if not a question that was resolved in favor of permitting annexations following defensive uses of force. Now, since then, and I think finally in the Friendly Relations Declaration, the understanding, we sort of crystallize an absolute prohibition of annexations, which in my view is a very, very good thing. But it still doesn't deal with the problem that the jus ad bellum does not itself resolve questions of the disposition of territory. Now, you might say about all of this, well, look, law is often old wine in new bottles, and you have to do the translation work to move from legal regimes that were established for different paradigms to new situations, and you sort of that's what lawyers do. They do that adaptive work. And I think that's true, but I think in this context, doing what the court did fails again to deal with the very deep and serious and severe structural problems that we are seeing in Israel-Palestine and in the world more generally. So one specific to this context, Israel-Palestine, I would say that there's a serious problem, which is that these two entities have not been able to figure out how to live side by side in ways that provide for peace and security for both. And that's just a factual problem on the ground. There are not mechanisms in international law for dealing with that problem. And you might say that the answer is to just, as the court said, Israel has to withdraw from territory that is not its own, and that is fine. But it's also clear that Israel is not prepared to respond to that on those terms, because Israel claims to have a serious security threat emanating from its neighbors, not just from Gaza, but also from Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, and Lebanon. And so failing to deal with this very serious structural problem and by structural, I mean a problem that goes to the possible coexistence of two states living side by side, failing actually to grapple with that while still calling for it, which is what the court does, is, in my view, sort of a recipe for not resolving the problem and not actually exposing the severity of the problem. I mean, the way the court tries to deal with this is by saying, okay, well, Israel needs to withdraw. Other states need to not recognize Israel's annexation. Makes sense. And the General Assembly needs to take seriously the project of trying to figure out how these two states can coexist together. But of course, the General Assembly is not a serious enough body to figure out how to administer and create a new security architecture in the region. And so that would naturally fall to more naturally fall to the Security Council. But then this gets to Devika's point about the Security Council being an institution that is, in this context, as in others like Ukraine, unable actually to resolve this problem. And so this then gets to the broader structural problem, I think, that the the advisory opinion case reveals, which is that we don't have in international law and in international politics good solutions for what to do once an annexation occurs. Once there is actually an annexation, the jus ad bellum is actually does not provide good answers to this question, because jus ad bellum prohibits the use of force, but then that prohibits the use of force to reclaim, that might prohibit the use of force to reclaim territory that has been annexed, as well as the use of force to annex a territory. Once the annexation is in place, it's not clear how that actually cashes out. This is especially true when you have an annexation conducted by a permanent member of the Security Council, as in the case of Ukraine. It's also true when you have an annexation being conducted by a state that is not itself a permanent member, but that is heavily supported by a permanent member of the Security Council, as you do in Palestine. And it is all the more so when you have permanent members of the Security Council on different sides of the contest over whether an annexation will or will not occur, as you have in both of these situations. Now, the answer to that might be that, well, now we have a new president in town in the United States, and maybe the P5 members could agree amongst themselves to allow annexations that they prefer. And that my very, very real concern is that is where we are heading, and I don't think international lawyers have taken it nearly seriously enough. If you take the ICJ advisory opinion for its word, which is to say that actually the annexatory conduct in Israel-Palestine is not just the actual use of force. Actually, much of the annexatory conduct has to do with things like transportation, maintaining transportation network, creating transportation networks, or the land building permit system, and things that are not actions by the state that are sort of bureaucratic administrative functions that are not necessarily uses of force in themselves. And if the court is saying, which I think is right, like this conduct is evidence of annexation, then we should look for indicia of annexations beyond circumstances involving the use of force, because as Ingrid and I tried to say in our piece, the prohibition of annexations is not entirely covered by the prohibition on the use of force. So what China is doing in the South China Sea, that is annexatory conduct that we should be taking very, very seriously right now. What Morocco is doing in Western Sahara, annexatory conduct that we should be taking very, very seriously right now. Turkey in Northern Cyprus, annexatory conduct that's just been sitting there. Israel and Palestine, annexatory conduct. Iran, what it wants to do with respect to Israel. It's trying to annex Israel. And so absent a serious reckoning about the fact that this is happening and that the permanent 5 members of the council are themselves participating in or encouraging such actions, I think we're not actually going to get a handle on the nature and severity of the problem. And I will just end by saying, so Devika mentioned my piece with Jacob Katz-Kogan on the 2 codes, and we can talk about like the ways in which we differ maybe in the Q&A, but I will just end by saying, if, as I think we can expect to happen, the United States retreats from many of its security commitments, we are likely to see even more efforts at annexations, and not just by the permanent 5, but also by other states that see an opportunity to take land in the absence of what has been sort of like a hyperpower paying attention to world events. So, you know, Ethiopia is acting in Somaliland, Venezuela is acting in Guyana. These are not the P5, but they're also states that are relying on their military power or coercive power to try to take territory that is not rightfully assigned to them under international law. And whereas historically, in the case of Ukraine, in the case of Kuwait, in the case of its security alliances, the United States has, at least for this subgroup of states, been a major force for maintaining the prohibition of annexations, although not for others. I think we can expect that to decline and the prohibition of annexation to be even newly at risk. So in my view, this is something that ought to be like, hair on fire. International lawyers should be intensely focused on this. Those organs and states that are interested in maintaining a basic state structure in which states are not constantly being eliminated, and we're not going back to like a world where we either have recolonization or something approaching a third world war, that those states ought to actually need to figure out how to fill in the gaps that are being created by a serious diminishment of U.S. presence and power and preservation of this prohibition. And I don't think simply saying, oh, the General Assembly ought to figure this out, as the court did in the advisory opinion, is actually a real solution to the very, very serious problems that we're confronting. I'll end there on that very dire note.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monica. That was a dire note as well. I was thinking it was President Trump, wasn't that, who said that the Golan Heights, it was during the previous administration, you know, declared that it was Israeli territory out of the blue. But also your proposition about state action is quite intriguing. I'm pretty sure we have 20 minutes. We can go a little bit further. I know Yuval has to leave sharp at 5:30. So I would like to give the floor to all our speakers. Maybe start with Anna. What would you like to comment? And if we can make our like the second round a bit brief, so all of you will have, and then we can further discuss. Anna.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will be really very brief. 3 points I want to address. First, just to reply quickly to Marko about pressure on the court from some Western states that actually they insisted there is no place for extraterritorial application of the convention. Yes, it is so, but time changes, their position changes, and just consider the Netherlands fighting against extraterritorial application of the convention in Jalut case, but then standing together with Ukraine in Ukraine and the Netherlands versus Russia case when MH17 plane with majority of Dutch citizens was downed. So, I mean, this position changed. Now, a very crucial point was brought by Devika about impartiality of international courts. The first victim of informational war or war of narratives, as Yuval put it, is justice. How we can protect judicial impartiality, for example, yes, in the situation we discussed in Gaza situation, when from every corner, from every gadget, from every appliance, you hear about genocide in Gaza. So does it affect judges in a way that this creates certain optics when they look into the case materials, also knowing that there is strong public expectations and public feelings they might consider necessary to foster? This is very, very serious question to consider when we are not only in military, in a war in military terms, but also in strong informational war. Now, the point, one point I wanted to address, what for me symbolizes a failure of major failure of international law, now is a failure to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression under the United Nations auspices. You know that the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over crimes of aggression in Ukraine. Now, the idea to have it within the United Nations failed, and the only option which is now on the table is the Council of Europe. and majority see it as a pragmatic alternative. And I strongly disagree with such an approach, because for me it's a very dangerous fragmentation of international criminal justice. When Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, he didn't just violate European peace, he violated foundational principles of international laws that we have been building since Nuremberg. And the crime of aggression is by very nature a universal crime. Yeah? And the Council of Europe might have the legal competence to establish such a tribunal, but this isn't just about legal possibility, it's about strategic wisdom. And our response to aggressive war must reinforce and not fragment the universal nature of international criminal justice. And this brings me to another point, my final point. What does it symbolize? Fragmentation in principle of international law, when there is no longer universal approach to many key concepts. There is no longer a single concept, let's say, of genocide. South African claim in the ICJ stood more on Jean-Paul Sartre concept of genocide rather than on Lemkin concept of genocide. And at the end of the day, I'm afraid we deal with different concepts of human dignity, which is a starting point for all rights and freedoms we have. And this is something maybe at some point international lawyers come together, come to the very beginning, the very foundation, and try to again set up universal values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for these very precise comments. What I take from you is the war of narratives. I think this is something very, very important to keep in mind. Marko, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I will be brief, which is what people normally say when they're not brief, but I promise I will actually be brief, because I just want to come back to my point, which is that there is really something problematic here when we focus on courts or law as being the problem or as failing to solve the problem, which is not really primarily legal in character, but is of a different kind. Yeah. So let me give you a domestic analogy. In Mexico, every year, there are tens of thousands of people dying in drug cartel-related violence. That's not because there's anything bad with the law of Mexico as it's written. Do you see what I mean? There's nothing wrong with the law of murder in Mexico, which is why the law of murder in Mexico needs to be rewritten, or anything else about the criminal law of Mexico. The reasons for those tens of thousands of people dying are of a very systemic political nature, social causes that cause that type of criminality, which make it very difficult to suppress. And it is not something that law as such or courts can fix. On the contrary, the political powers in Mexico decided to destroy the independent judiciary in Mexico, which is what they just accomplished through constitutional amendments. So I really find it problematic to adopt this narrative that somehow Gaza and Ukraine show that international courts and international law have failed. I think, on the contrary, international courts and lawyers have done, by and large, what they could do, but they can't solve the problem of war and peace, just like they can't solve by themselves the problem of climate change or poverty or inequality or God knows how many horrible challenges facing the world today. And if you want to make the world a better place, being a lawyer is not necessarily how you best do it. Yeah? It's not, our profession is not sort of what fixes things in that particular way. So I understand this narrative, this sense that we are on a path of regression and decline, which we to an extent are. But I would just remind you that when most of us were born, the world was actually worse than it is today. So in the Cold War, the world was worse than it is today. Much worse than it is today. It was on the brink of nuclear war at any given moment in time. So I don't think this sense of despair and failure is necessarily justified. And by the way, I say this as kind of the example of a person from a country where international law kind of worked, in the sense that my country, the former Yugoslavia, fell apart. 100,000 people were killed only in the war in Bosnia. Yet most of the people who committed crimes in that conflict, well, at least most of the leaders, not all of them, but many of them, ended up in international courtroom. So I don't think, this sense of despair on the one hand, or the sense that international law is the problem, is the right approach here. The root causes of the problems are different, and their solutions are not legal, they're political, is what I would say. So that's as much as I think I want to say.
Thank you very, very much. I feel this is like something that I deal with on a daily basis, like question, why doesn't international law stop that? Or what is it doing? What's the point? It's irrelevant. Anyway, I'm not going to say that. Devika, you have the floor, and then Yuval. I'm concerned about Yuval's departure. So Devika.
Should I give way to Yuval, actually? I'll come back to me, Maria, afterwards. I'd love to hear what Yuval has to say first.
If that's okay with you too,
Of
yeah,
course.
maybe, yeah, Yuval.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Devika, and I apologize for jumping the queue. So I will say I won't say that I will be brief, but I will try. So I will also follow Jana's example of 3 points. So I actually enjoyed hearing Mutaz's intervention. And I think we do agree on some of the diagnosis, but not necessarily on what to prescribe, what remedy to prescribe. So I think there is, yes, I mean, courts are weak, and Marko is right. I mean, there are limits to what courts can do in a very, and Monica said that as well, in a very complicated world environment. There are problems that courts can help resolving. There are problems that courts might not be able resolving, but Mutaz took the view that as a result, we need to scale up the performance. So courts have to decide more, and they have to decide faster. And I draw, for the reasons I explained before, the opposite conclusion, that courts have to, because the system is weak, they have to tread carefully and establish gradually their authority. And this is, I think, a lesson that the ICJ did internalize. The ICC might have still some way to go in internalizing this. We'll see. And as for Marko's, which era is better, Marko is probably right, but let's talk in 2-3 years and we'll see then the comparison will be interesting. The second point, which I wanted to make, and again, allude to Mutaz, I would say that Israelis are as disillusioned about international law as Palestinians are at some level. So this is actually where we are divided by a common perception. And just we just had the ceasefire entered into force today. But the ceasefire in Lebanon is a result, I mean, the war in Lebanon is a result of a spectacular failure by the UN actually to keep the peace. We have peacekeepers in Lebanon. They were mandated by the Security Council to keep the peace in 2006. But they have sat on their hands and they have allowed the resolution on the basis of which they were deployed to southern Lebanon to basically become a dead letter. So when and this is directly related to what Monica said. So when you have an expectation that the international cavalry would come in and resolve disputes, there needs to be a show of effectiveness. So if you have peacekeepers who are unable completely to confront Hezbollah in Lebanon, how can you expect a country like Israel in this regard to basically accept this as a guarantee going forward? So now there will be an additional belt and suspenders. So now the Americans and the French are going to provide some guarantees. But I mean, we do have a serious problem of enforcement. I don't have time to develop this, but the Gaza situation also has a similar feature. There were European monitors on the border between Gaza and Egypt. Egypt, and once Hamas took over, they escaped to Israel. So and the whole system collapsed, leading eventually to blockades and closures. So we do have there a problem, an enforcement problem, which is also within international institutions. And finally, I do want to support what Monica said about the advisory opinion, but from the point of view of where should the emphasis be? The emphasis should be, I believe, in these sort of almost intractable problems on finding political solutions that could work. And in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there were two frameworks that were critical, and at some point in time, they did appear to work. There was Security Council Resolution 242, on the basis of which the parties have recognized each other and entered into a peace process, and there was the Oslo Accords. And both of them are almost, they have almost disappeared from the narrative that the court has laid down, because the court has taken this from the path of peacemaking and direct negotiations and agreements to a more abstract path of international principles as applied by the General Assembly. This is a recipe for failure. And this is a recipe, in my view, for the continuation of the conflict. And this tension between international dispute settlement to a more abstract notion of international justice is something that we as an international community have to come up with ways to resolve in ways that actually help real people on the ground from avoiding being, victims of violence and suffering. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Yuval. Devika.
Hello. There is so much to speak about, Maria. What an incredible panel you put together. I've learned so much from everything I've heard. This idea, and Maria put the words in, this war of narratives really worries me. And look, here I am about to embrace my own irrelevance, as we all are. It is so important that we lower the expectations of what law can do, that it is too big a burden that is placed on international law. So this justice is an easy word to wield, but it's so difficult to define. And that concept of universal justice, which I completely agree that we aspire to, but it's even more capacious, and it has that added deceit of promising more that it can deliver. So I think something we're all united around is that the enforcement power and the substructure of this rhetoric of universal justice is very weak. And the paradox is that state officials and states are both its creators and the targets. So they're not going to be the ones that build up this structure. What we then have, all we have, are the legal determinations, the words of the law. And this is where I agree with Ganna again, this issue of impartiality is so important. That really, where we have a court escaping from this arsenal of jargon that can't possibly achieve any form of meeting of minds, when we have an agreement that, and I hear your point, I've read your article, Monica, and I also should say to everybody, there's a wonderful podcast, Jib Jab, where Ingrid and Monica speak about their article. But, at least we have a situation where we now have a court ruling that annexation is unlawful, or that it is annexation and that it is unlawful. Now, there are big limitations on the law. The fact that the word genocide is the word we're all using now is basically about the jurisdictional limits on the ICJ and the reason they had to use the Genocide Convention. I realise a lot of people would disagree with me and that they think genocide is the appropriate word to use, but arguably it would be far more appropriate if that case was argued on the basis of IHL, perhaps crimes against humanity. Now, my concluding point is actually really that we should stop turning our blame on international legal mechanisms. I'm even not going to blame states, but I actually want to bring us all into the fray, that if we as as individuals think that the structures are not strong enough, we have got to actually assume membership now of this international community. You know, so identity politics enters the frame. You know, we're used to identifying ourselves as a member of the Smith family, or a Real Madrid fan, or an Australian, but we're less likely to identify ourselves as a member of the international community. And that these causes have to become our own causes, and we have to start to take responsibility and push for states to build these structures, make them stronger, because ultimately it's going to be third states, not those engaged, who are going to be able to put the pressure on states involved to stop these horrendous wars. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Devika. And we have Mutaz and then Monica. Mutaz?
Just two quick comments. First, I used to say, as Marko and Devika were saying, that the problem is not with international law, but the recent events show that international law, there is a problem in international law and international institutions themselves. And the reason for that is that the creators of international law are like now destroying international law. And the case of Palestine, which is actually what is going in Ukraine, is just a drop in the ocean in comparison with what is going on in Gaza. Of course, I'm not undermining what is going in Ukraine, and I understand and agree it is horrible to have aggression against Ukraine. But the scale of killing, the scale of crimes in Gaza are not comparable to those with Ukraine. And yet, the international so-called international community, or the Western powers, are supporting and enabling Israel. As we know, Israel was created as an international project, a Western European project, and the Western powers now are like using their double standards, are enabling Israel by providing it with weapons, with diplomatic protection, and giving it immunity at international institutions, and defending it actually at the ICC, at all levels, at the investigation, prosecution, and now after the issue of issuing of arrest warrant. The second comment is a reply to Yuval, although he left now. He said that the October 7th was unprovoked, and I think it is not true. What happened on October 7th was the result of 15 years of blockade on Gaza. What do you expect from people who were under siege for 15 years, under torture, miserable life, to do? So actually, the occupation is the provocation of what happened in Gaza, and not what Gaza did. Although I'm not really defending violence in general, like I'm like an advocate of peace for settlement of disputes, but not war. But I think this should be said. So Israel was not really acting as self-defense, but rather as an act of aggression, ongoing aggression since 1948. And the other thing, also a reply to Yuval regarding the issue of complementarity in Israel. There is not a thing that called the complementarity in Israel. Everybody knows that the Israeli courts are biased. The Israeli judicial system is enabling the occupation, and even providing some legal directions to the Israeli military and Israeli politicians on how to violate international law in like acceptable way for the West. So the Israeli judiciary is just the judicial arm of the Israeli occupation, and there is no such a thing as called complementarity, and we should not expect the Israeli judiciary to take any action against Israeli war criminals in Gaza or elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Mutaz. And Monica, I can see also, whatever you are, I can see also there were particular questions for you on chat about the proposition of annexation, of filling the gaps of annexation. I don't know if you would like to elaborate.
Okay, I'll say, since I was invited to, so I guess I want to say three things too. The first is I just want to say to Mutaz and Anna, Yana, I'm just so sorry that you're both experiencing this. I think when I look out at the world and I see what's happening, I find it completely devastating, and I don't have a personal connection to it. And I feel that way for your states, and I feel that way about all of the states that I envision having real problems as the United States is likely to retreat. And it's heartbreaking. So I'm really sorry. So that's the first thing I want to say. And I can hear it in your voices, and I feel it on some level, although not the extent that you do. The second thing I'll just say is I'll respond to this comment really quickly, which is about whether there are ways of filling the gaps on annexations. And I guess my answer is, and I've said this to basically everyone who will listen to me, of which there are not that many, and I say, I think it's really important that there be a new social and political movement led not by the United States, not by the West, to double down on the proposition that states need to be preserved and solidified as states and entities that, and that we should not be in the business of eliminating states, that annexations are absolutely unlawful. We can disagree on lots and lots of other things, but annexations of whatever form must be prohibited. I think that is something that states as a whole should be able to get behind. And I think that a lot of the way in which the conversation has proceeded has obscured from view the importance of standing behind this very basic and foundational principle of the international legal system. And I say this totally cognizant of the fact that states are complicated entities, and that lots of states have carried with them the historical injustices of the past, and lots of states are themselves not good actors toward their own people, not good actors toward other peoples. And nevertheless, I think, like, in the current world, we don't have plausible alternatives for states as states, and we should be able to double down on that proposition. And the fact that we have not is a serious cause for concern. So that's how I would say, like, the first step to filling the gap. The last thing I want to say is just in response to Marko's point, and to another comment in the feed about the relationship between law and politics in this particular moment. So I agree with the sentiment that international law is not the problem. Of course, international law is not the problem. International law is, like, a function and in some ways, and a cause of both cause and effect of the world in which we live. I do think there is reason for despair, I guess, unlike Marko, as was indicated in my earlier remarks. And part of the reason I think there's reason for despair is that I think it's not right to imagine that the legal and the political, or the legal and the geopolitical, operate in separate spheres in any way. They're deeply interconnected and interdependent. And so, in my view, we are seeing a massive change in the international legal system that we had experienced since World War II, but really since the Cold War. Now, this might be good or might be bad. Likely it's both good and bad, good in some ways and bad in others. The pre-existing international legal system, the one that is now in decay, obviously in decay, across a broad range of issues, not just what's happening in Ukraine and Palestine, not just with respect to the use of force, not just with respect to annexations. We've been following this for years on trade, on investment, on the backlash in human rights that we've been seeing. So the international legal system is undergoing a massive and foundational shift. And in my view, the shift is a reflection of the fact that international law has always been embedded with and dependent on sources of power to uphold it. And this is Mutaz's point to some extent, that the system that we have now is a creature in many ways of what powerful states created at a particular moment. Now shifts in the power structures mean that law is also going to shift, and this means that which was good about the previous international legal system, of which I think there was some, is newly at risk in ways that it was not previously. And so this, I guess, is a way of invoking Devika's point that, like, it falls to international lawyers, international policymakers, states that are not themselves states that are not the United States, states that are not necessarily Russia or Israel or China, to step into this gap and to try to a combination of new law and new power behind a new international legal system. So I think it would be a mistake to try to cling with bare-knuckled fists to a legal system that is now in decay. I think we need to be honest about the fact that this legal system is in decay, and I think we need to think about how we can preserve that which is worth preserving and how we can create something different. And that will require us to think not just about law in the abstract as it might operate, but the combination of how law can bolster various forms of power to be functional and legit, as effective and as legitimate as it possibly can be for something that is like somewhat resembling the common good. So I would say this is like a moment of transformational change that requires a serious, considered effort to think about what we're going to create and what kind of world we're going to have from here on out. And that's a role for lawyers, and it's a role for policymakers, because it requires the two to work in conjunction together, to the extent that international law is going to be part of the picture going forward. That's it.
Yes, thank you very much, Monica. I don't know if, I mean, we are running late. I don't know if you want to add anything, like a last comment from Yuval and Anna. They had to go. They had other previous commitment. If I can take the opportunity, being the moderator of this panel, I want to thank you once more for very, very interesting. I wish we had more time. There are so many important issues. And I think with the occasion, with the case studies, actually we went very much into foundational questions, whether about the relevance of international law, about whether we're in a moment of transformational moment, as Monica highlighted here. But while you were talking, I couldn't help it, but I was thinking about Koskieniemi and the culture of formalism, to be honest, Monica. And I was thinking also about the annexation and the filling the gaps. Somehow the risk with that, and also the question at the end of the day, who has the authority to decide of what we keep and what we leave behind, which maybe, it takes us back to 0 point, but I feel a little bit skeptical and somehow anxious, to be honest, about that. When we can allow other states than the usual suspects to come and fill the gaps, and how can we secure that those other states are not going to repeat? They're not going to be like the animal farm, like they're not going to wear the clothes of the pigs, like in the animal farm, becoming the previous powerful states. So there's so many things and so many issues that I believe we can discuss forever. On that note, I would like to thank you very, very much from all the parts of the world. I want to thank Marko, Mutaz from East Jerusalem, Devika around the corner, and Monica from the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you once more. I don't know how many times I say thank you, but you really, I think we managed to have a very fruitful and rich discussion roundtable by highlighting each of you the issues you would like to highlight. And I hope we will have the opportunity to continue having this type of discussion more often. I think it's very, very important. And you never know, we are going to have a new president on the other side of the Atlantic. And yeah, I'm pretty sure, these dystopian topics will come again and again, but maybe I'm wrong. We never know. So on that note, thank you all very much, and thank the participants. And I'm looking forward to the next discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.